Hi, and welcome back for our lecture on pedestrian facilities. Just to put things in context, remember that we started the semester by covering some of the foundational information for the field, and then we talked about traffic calming at the highest level, and I mentioned that we dig into each of these topics in a little bit more detail. So in that vein, today we're going to be talking about pedestrian facilities. I wanted to show you some examples of pop-up interventions before we begin. When we talk about making infrastructure changes to support active transportation, they often sound expensive and complex, but there are definitely ways to give people the experience of what a pedestrian supportive or cyclist supportive infrastructure change might look like without making the huge investment that might be needed for things like permanent installations in concrete and that sort of thing. So we'll take a look at a few of those first, and then we'll dig into pedestrian facilities specifically. So here's an example of a pop-up intervention. This one was placed in Boston. As you can see, kind of in the middle there was a separated bike lane established with paint. But cyclists in the area were finding, if you look kind of ahead the block, you can see, even though the bike lane is there, that it's often filled with parked cars, which really rules out the possibility of using it for safe cycling. So cyclists in the area decided to just create a temporary separation using those traffic cones and potted plants. And what they found that it was just this very cheap and affordable installation was enough to keep the traffic and the parked cars out of the bike lane. So sometimes these changes that we talk about sound really complex and difficult, and when installed permanently can be very expensive, but they can also be accomplished sometimes by a much simpler approach. Here's another example of using cones to mark out a bike lane. In the first picture, you can actually see that it's a municipal vehicle, right? It's the city bus that's encroaching into the bike lane, and that just, again, the use of the traffic cones were enough to keep the bike lane out. Again, this pop-up intervention that was done in Boston. And then just another example of how this could be done cheaply and affordably. This one actually used some temporary planters and even things like duct tape or astroturf, basically just using them to mark out separate areas of infrastructure for different kinds of transportation. So just some different ideas about how this could be used to give people a taste of what a protected bike lane or separated kind of biking facility or pedestrian infrastructure might feel, and then we can help to get people on board. We have actually seen this used in Las Vegas on a temporary basis. There's a festival called the Better Block Festival that was here in town a couple of years ago, and you can see how a very normal, typical downtown street in Las Vegas was transformed using some pop-up installation, some street furniture, some temporary potted plants, and you can see how it just really changes the whole look and feel of that street, even in Las Vegas. Okay, now let's talk more specifically about pedestrian facilities and what do we know works. I think a good place to start is that much of what we're familiar with, if you do live here in Las Vegas, is what doesn't work. This is a real neighborhood in the Henderson area. If you maybe live at point A and you're interested and you've got a dentist appointment, or you'd like to go over to the Starbucks or pick up some Chinese food, these facilities are a very short distance from your home. If you were able to walk there directly, you could easily walk over to the Starbucks, maybe pick up 1,000 or 2,000 steps along the way. But the way that we build our single entry neighborhoods in Las Vegas means that you have to go a good 3/4 of the mile out of your way to get to this commercial facility that you could probably see from your backyard. And we know that even beyond the strict distance of the walk, that anytime we ask people to go out of their way, to go what in their head feels like the wrong way in order to walk someplace safely, that they're less likely to do it. So this whole idea of separating people from their destinations through infrastructure is kind of the way that we build our pedestrian facilities here in Las Vegas. When we look at trying to assess what does work, again, as we've discussed with other topics, the question of what to measure is still developing. Some of the studies in the field look at the residents in the area's probability of commuting to work by walking, so whether or not they would be likely to walk to work. Other studies have looked at the percentage of walking for work trips and shopping trips as opposed to recreational trips. Some have just counted the number of bike and walk trips. Others look at the likelihood of taking walking trips, the likelihood of meeting physical activity recommendations, and then sometimes if there's been a change made in the area, then we can measure the change in mode share, right? How many people have switched maybe from cars to walking. So when we start to try to compare studies across this area of research, it can be sometimes tricky because they may be assessing this question of why people are walking, where they're walking, and if it changes in slightly different ways. In terms of the kinds of measures that go into these calculations, again, there's a broad measure of things that are concluded, a broad set of things that are included. One could be the proximity of destinations. We can see how that could be helpful, but also just based on our previous example from Henderson, the destination may be an eighth of a mile away, but the person at point A is still not going to walk to it. We may decide to assess mixed land use. As you covered in built environment, you know this means a variety of different kinds of establishments. We could try to measure population density. We do know that walking trips are more common where more people live per square mile. We could try to assess the aesthetics. What does the walk actually look and feel like? Some more concrete things to measure could be the presence of sidewalks, street connectivity, measures of safety, either from traffic danger or stranger danger. Sometimes we look at neighborhood type. And then, of course, there's the whole question of whether we're going to do these as objective measures or perceived measures. And then what's the scale, right? Are we trying to measure this at the city level and then try to assess whether people walk in this city compared to a different city? Or do we need to make that more granular and look at things like neighborhood or census block, or maybe like a half-mile buffer around the person's house? You can see as you start to dig into this, that can get pretty complicated. So another thing that we encounter when we try to measure who walks and why is that many of these studies are actually cross-sectional, that we're just surveying people about their walking habits. It can be really difficult to do the kinds of prospective or intervention studies that we like to see in order to establish firmer evidence. Some of the other things that we run into may be if we're trying to assess whether sidewalks are present in the area, but what if those sidewalks don't really go anywhere? We do see that sometimes in Vegas, right, where the sidewalk is finished on one block but not the next. So the presence of the sidewalk on your block may not encourage you to walk, but that's just because really when you get to the next block, there's no place for you to connect to. Other things that we run into is that areas where walking is more common, biking is also more common. So it can be difficult to kind of separate out just the effects for walking. And we also see that biking can be more susceptible to change because one of the major barriers to taking walking trips is distance, right? You're probably, if you live in Centennial Hills, you're probably not going to be walking to campus. But there is a possibility that one day, if the facilities were safe enough and you were motivated enough, maybe you could ride your bike, right? You could probably get down here in an hour as opposed to maybe 3/4 of a day, right? So we do see more ability to shift mode share to biking because of that important and difficult to change barrier of distance. And then the other thing is that if we look at this from an equity perspective, the kinds of communities most likely to see changes tend to be communities of privilege, right? They tend to be ones where we've got active real estate investment, or they may be ones where we've got politically active residents. And many of these draw the money to areas where the need is not the greatest, right? Where there are other communities that really could use this kind of investment, especially when it affects population level health. So lots going on in terms of measurement in the field. I am going to pull up some specific case studies to walk through, even though it's difficult to draw broad conclusions because of the variety of studies. Let's take a look at this one out of Boulder, Colorado. One of the important changes that Boulder, Colorado has gone through in the past couple of decades is that they made a concerted effort to start investing in walking-friendly infrastructure. So they had a complete streets policy. Anytime that construction was done in an area, the street had to meet certain standards. You can see things in the pictures at the bottom, things like pedestrian plazas. You can see bike parking, right? So these kinds of infrastructure changes or additions were mandated by local policy. And over the time period of those couple of decades, we've seen that Boulder has become one of the biking and walking friendliest cities in the country. They actually have 20 times the national average for the number of bike trips and 3 times the national average for the number of walking trips. So we see, that investment works, and that when we provide people with facilities, that people do tend to change their transportation behavior. A lot of the results out of Boulder are assessed in terms of car traffic. And over the couple of decades, they did see a significant decrease in both single and multiple occupancy vehicle traffic. And they saw that mode shift to more public health friendly transportation modes such as public transit or biking. The change in walking went from about 18% to about 20%. This one was not significant, but again, there are barriers that are difficult to change when it comes to increasing walking trips. And Boulder, as a newer city, faced some of those distance barriers. One intervention in New Orleans that was specific to walking was a walking path that was added to a new school playground. And this was a time-sensitive study, right? It was conducted over 2 years. And they did find an increase in physical activity amongst people who lived near this walking path. And it was a significant increase compared to control neighborhoods. And they did actually do this through observation, right? So it's an objective measure. They went out and they observed activity in the area, and they were specifically assessing moderate to vigorous physical activity. They found this was actually construction that was completed after Katrina, so there was rebuilding going on in the area. And in the particular intervention neighborhood, they did see an increase in physical activity, an increase of 41% compared to 24 and 38% in the control neighborhoods. So if we take a look at what this looked like, we can see that the area surrounded in the pink is where the assessments were done for the intervention area. You can see that thing that looks like a little yellow ruler was actually the walking path. And then the green and blue outline neighborhoods are the comparison areas. So when the researchers assessed moderate and vigorous physical activities in the pink box, they found over 2 years a significantly larger increase for the population in that area where the walking facilities were added. Another example, and this one is kind of an example of how pedestrian-only facilities can be difficult to kind of tease out and isolate. This is a complete streets intervention that was completed in Orlando. So we've got some before and after pictures, before on the left, and then but after down on the right. We can see the addition of a road diet, bicycle lanes, and the ways that you can imagine the ways that this might affect transportation behavior in the area. And what they found was actually a reduction in speeding, right? And we know this is an important part of encouraging pedestrian behavior because people feel safer when the cars around them are not exceeding the speed limit. And also a reduction in crashes and injuries, crashes down crashes down 1/3 and injuries down 2/3 from before these changes were made. In terms of actually assessing pedestrian use, they did find a 23% increase in the number of pedestrians who were using the area. And also, because it's interesting, when we make these kinds of changes, we often hear from merchants or landowners in the area that it could affect business, right? If we take away the on-street parking or if we reduce the number of lanes, that they'll see fewer customers. But almost inevitably, we see the opposite. And in this case, there were actually over 70 new businesses that were opened in the area over a 2-year period, over 560 new jobs, and over a 3/4 increase in property values adjacent to this complete streets intervention. So it's really these kinds of changes tend to improve many measures related to transportation behavior and some related to quality of life. But it can be really difficult to just say, look at those examples from Orlando and say, well, what if we just change the sidewalk, right? We won't see the same level of change from a single intervention like that. And realistically, in the real world, we're unlikely to get funding for that, whereas a full complete streets or road diet intervention is something that's much more likely to get funded. Overall, if we look at measures that affect pedestrian safety, things like raised medians and intersection redesign, these can really help to decrease pedestrian versus car crashes. The data tells us by over a quarter that we can see that reduced risk. We do know that speed reduction is very important. If you look at the different potential speeds in a pedestrian versus car crash, if you're hit by a car going 40 miles an hour, 80% of pedestrians will die. But if you're hit by a car going 20 miles an hour, only 5% of pedestrians will die. Another issue for pedestrian safety, much less important, but still something that tends to come up in community meetings and that kind of thing, is the cyclist versus pedestrian crash. These do happen rarely. They're much less likely to be fatal than pedestrian versus car crashes, but they do seem to get some attention. And one of the great things about a complete streets intervention is that it does give cyclists their own safe place to ride and keeps them off sidewalks and separated from pedestrians. So when we look at research into the field, one of the current issues, one of the things that is getting a lot of attention right now is the idea of perception versus reality. So if I think that the trip between my house and my child's school is dangerous, I'm unlikely to let my child walk, right? So there may be wonderful sidewalks, there may be protected crossings, there may be pedestrian walkways even, or the presence of crossing guards. But because of my belief that it's a dangerous area to walk, none of those would actually affect my willingness to let my child walk to school. So there's some great work being done about supporting infrastructure changes, like if we're going to improve sidewalk or intersection safety, then support that with education and programming, right? Some kind of community outreach. But it is a really complex area because anytime that we're dealing with perception, how much are we really going to invest in that compared to the actual infrastructure changes? How do we know whether we've been successful? So it can be a really complicated area of research. Another thing that's been getting a lot of attention is how far people are willing to walk. If we're going to give up our car and walk, how far are most of us willing to go for a destination? For a long time, the measure that was used was a quarter mile, that most people are willing to walk a quarter mile. But it turns out this was actually anecdotal. It was never actually studied. And one interesting way that I've seen this assessed is the average distance that people are willing to walk to a transit stop. Like if you think about if you had a bus stop near your house, or if you do, how close would that have to be for you to be willing to walk instead of maybe drive or get dropped off? And what that study found is actually it's 0.4 of a mile, or about 600 meters, that most people are willing to walk to transit. And then we also see, of course, this varies a lot by the individual person, right? This could make a big difference if you're a healthy 20-year-old or an 80-year-old with arthritis. So it can be difficult to come up with a broad assessment that says people will walk a quarter mile but no farther. In terms of behavior change, one of the things we are seeing is that disincentives are more powerful than incentives, right? So if we have employers who want to maybe give people a small monthly bonus or a discount on their health insurance if they're willing to walk or bike to work, that will definitely help to shift some behavior. But if we make parking more expensive or less convenient, then we definitely see more behavior shift. So most people are more motivated by inconvenience than they are by incentives. And then, of course, because distance is such a barrier in so many areas of our country, it's really combining walking trips with transit trips, with public transit, where we can really start to see behavior change. We can start to see some shift even in newer, more car-centric cities like Las Vegas. So these are some areas that are getting a lot of attention in the research right now, and I'd expect to see some interesting results there over the next couple of years. Okay. So in our lecture here on pedestrian facilities, we looked at some pop-up interventions and how we can use these kind of temporary, cheaper, short-term interventions to give people a feel for what pedestrian or cyclist-friendly infrastructure actually looks like and feels like. And then we went through what actually works for pedestrians, keeping in mind that it's rare to have an intervention that focuses solely on pedestrians without looking at some interventions for car transit, like road diets, or the addition of bike lanes if it's a complete streets intervention, that sort of thing. In Boulder, we had kind of the long-term approach where those consistent investments have led to some very, very outstanding results. In New Orleans, we had that prospective study, right, where we saw the walking trail added and pre and post follow-up after 2 years. So we had that kind of great study design that we like to see. Again, more walking behavior where that protected walking path was available. And then in Orlando, we had, again, kind of a more catch-all approach with that road diet. And we saw the improvements in pedestrian safety, pedestrian behavior, and then also economic benefits for businesses in the area. So thanks for joining me today, and I will see you soon for our next lecture.